trade agreements. We can achieve that ourselves. It's really a domestic issue, and I'm a free trader, and a lot of people say they're free traders, but when I say free trade, I mean over here we should have
time until 2 p.m. be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, and all quorum calls during that time also be equally divided.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, in a few hours, this chamber will have the opportunity to restore benefits for 1.7 million American job seekers and help reduce the national deficit by $1.2 billion. I believe my colleagues understand that this is a fiscally responsible way to help job seekers who are still struggling in the aftermath of the Great Recession. UI helps people to look for work, while at the same time bolstering consumer demand and supporting the economy, which is why the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office has estimated that renewing unemployment insurance for 1 year will save 200,000 jobs. This is an imperative. We must do this on behalf of the families who are struggling, on behalf of our economy that needs the support. This is something that must be done. Now the question is whether we can move this critical bill forward and send help to those who are struggling through no fault of their own. Everyone understands that to qualify for unemployment insurance, you have to be working and you have to lose your job through no fault of your own, and that you have to continue to search for work. And the reality in this market is that there are, in many cases, 3 applicants for every job. And we've all heard the stories when we've gone home to our states. The software engineer who's worked for 20 years, who's put out 300 resumes, who's followed people around to give them resumes. I heard the story of an individual who was so persistent to try to get a job in the financial services that he would show up early in the morning and put his resume in the local newspaper for the head of the bank he was interviewing with. And that eventually got him a call back, I'm told, but not yet a job. It's very difficult. And we can do what we've always done, is help these struggling Americans and help our economy. At every point in this process, I believe we have responded to the issues raised by our colleagues to try to get this done. Instead of a full year of extended unemployment benefits, which I propose, which we typically do, we compromised on a short-term extension in order just to get it done. Just to get it done, because since December 28th, people have lost their benefits. They went off a cliff. Every week, 60,000 more Americans lose their benefits. It's up to 1.7 million now. It'll be several million before this year is run out. And so instead of a typical 1-year extension, we're asking for 3 months. Most of it now, or a large part of it, being retroactive to make up to those people who lost their benefits beginning on December 28th. And I was joined, and I must thank him for his tremendous leadership, by Senator Dean Heller of Nevada. This is a bipartisan effort. It's a bipartisan effort because this unemployment, particularly this long-term unemployment problem, knows no political dimension or geographic dimension or ethnic or gender dimension. It is an American problem, and we're responding on a bipartisan way, Senator Hill and I. And we put what we thought was a pathway to provide immediate aid to these job seekers and give us enough time to work through these complex issues that many of my colleagues have raised. Issues about, well, can we make the program overall more effective? Can we incentivize individuals to seek more employment more efficiently? Can we integrate training? All of those are important issues, but in the context of a 3-month emergency extension, the first thing to do is get the relief to the people, and then to sit down conscientiously and deliberately and work on the details. When this concession wasn't enough to break a filibuster, Democrats put forth another proposal, again, after consultation with our Republican colleagues. And I thank Senator Heller, but Senator Collins, Senator Portman, Senator Coates, many others, who consciously and conscientiously provided thoughts, provided input, etc. This was not a my way or the highway. This was trying to find a bipartisan pathway, and we're still searching. So based on those comments, we now propose a fully paid-for extension of unemployment insurance. Then we started off with 11.5 months fully paid for. We used a pay-for that would have been an extension of the mandatory savings agreed to in the bipartisan budget agreement, which had been endorsed by House Budget Chairman Congressman Paul Ryan. And we also included in that proposal, the long-term proposal, a major policy change proposed by Senator Portman addressing overlapping unemployment and disability insurance payments. None of these changes are very easy for us to accept on our side. The tradition or the routine has to be unpaid for unemployment extension. Very few times have we paid for these because they're considered emergency spending. This is an emergency. People are struggling out there. But we accepted the premise, which our Republican colleagues suggested, has to be paid for. Then we accepted the premise also that we couldn't pay for it by tax revenues. It would have to be paid for by something else. And so we took a proposal that was embedded in the budget, and we tried to use that together with a proposal that was first presented by Senator Portman. But we had a vote on this, another cloture vote, and none of our Republican colleagues supported it. Well, then we had a vote on the underlying measure, again, the short-term extension, the 3-month extension unpaid for by Senator Heller and I, and Senator Heller joined us on that vote, and I thank him for that. But still not the significant number of Republican colleagues necessary not only to move this measure forward, but also to do the right thing. And we're here today, Mr. President. We've had another round of extensive discussions and consultations, and we're now about to pay for a 3-month extension of the unemployment benefits, some of it retroactive, which is fully paid for. And I will point out, it is February. This extension will go forward until March. We're reaching the point, ironically, where we might have more retroactive payments than prospective payments. That's why, again, we have to move, and we have to move today. It's not everything we wanted, certainly. I mean, we would have, as I said initially, we would have preferred a full year, give people certainty for the year. We would have, as we've done more times than not, declared emergency spending. But in order to conscientiously and thoughtfully and cooperatively and collaboratively work with our colleagues, we have continually sort of agreed to make concessions. That I used to think was the nature of political compromise, principled political compromise. And we've tried. So now we have a 3-month bill. It's paid for by a technique called pension smoothing, which we have enacted on a bipartisan basis. In fact, the vote was 79 to 19 in the 2012 transportation bill, MAP 21. So this is not a controversial pay for. This is something that we have embraced before. It is something that does not involve revenues, which is one of the benchmarks that our colleagues laid down. So we have a short-term, fully paid-for UI benefit that can go out immediately to people who are suffering, that is paid for by a non-controversial mechanism. And essentially, it will do what I think we have been requested to do by our colleagues on this side. Now, our request is simply support us in this effort so that we can get this legislation accomplished. One of the interesting things about this pay for is not only was it in the transportation bill and it's due to expire and we'll extend it, but also it's been used on numerous occasions by colleagues on both sides of the aisle to pay for a various assembly of different legislative proposals. So this is not a controversial mechanism. I don't think UI is controversial. I think people hopefully recognize that it's necessary in this situation. We've also included a provision in this proposal that has been championed aggressively and thoughtfully by Senator Coburn that will bar individuals with income over $1 million from receiving federal unemployment insurance benefits. It's passed this House, I believe, this Assembly, this chamber, by a vote of 100 to 1, I think, when it was brought up. That's my recollection, but I will defer to the record. And then the other factor, which I would argue to my colleagues, is as we try to pay for this extension, we're also able to accrue $1.2 billion over 10 years to reduce the deficit. So if my colleagues are looking for proposals that are fully paid for, reduce the deficit, and provide needed assistance to Americans who have worked and are looking for work and desperately want a job, we need their vote this afternoon. So I hope we can move forward on this bill. Help unemployed Americans who are searching for work. Help employers, because this pension smoothing mechanism helps employers, and also reduce the deficit. That's a pretty good trifecta, something I think we should support. And the other point I want to make at this point is that the notion that unemployment insurance, federal long-term benefits, should be a political issue is, I think, in stark contrast to history. Congress has renewed UI on a bipartisan basis in the past on numerous occasions. We did it 3 times under President Ronald Reagan. We did it 5 times under President George W. Bush. So I think that's the precedent to get it done today. That's pretty good precedent on a bipartisan basis under 2 Republican presidents. But one of the questions comes up, and it really does the Republican leadership, not some of the members who we've collaborated with very closely, but do they want this to pass? Or will they say, no, it's forget the substance, it's so compelling. Let's talk about process. This is about how many amendments we have. This is about whether or not we can reform and reauthorize an entire legislative program based on a 3-month extension, most of which is becoming rapidly retroactive, not proactive, or going forward. I think the American people see through this. The substance is clear. This program has been repeatedly reauthorized to deal with long-term unemployment under Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, on a bipartisan basis. It is fully paid for. It is paid for by a non-controversial technique that does not include revenues. In fact, the pay for is something that the corporate world supports. There are others who might say, well, we're disappointed because there's another major issue out there, and there is, and that's the COLA for military retirees. And the issue of the COLA has to be dealt with. It will be dealt with. But I want to point out that COLA does not become effective, those reductions, until December of 2015. People receiving UI lost their benefits December of last year. They are already suffering. There is no more time for them in terms of we can fix it before it takes effect. We need to act today. And indeed, it's been estimated that there's 20,000 veterans who have been denied long-term unemployment benefits because of our failure to extend them. So for those 20,000 veterans, I don't think it'd be sufficient to tell them, you're not going to get your unemployment insurance because we're worried about what's going to happen in December of 2015 to some other veterans. If you want to help veterans right away today, you can help 20,000 of them by voting for this provision going forward. So let's just help both the unemployed and our veterans and not try to use one group against the other, et cetera, for a legislative advantage in terms of any one particular measure. The emergency for unemployment insurance that encompasses at least 20,000 veterans is today, not a year or more from now. We can't turn our back on the 1.7 million Americans and it's growing each week. We've got to help them. It's been 40 days since unemployment insurance benefits expired, Mr. President, for millions of Americans. That's 40 days too long for those who are downsized with the recession and now find their UI benefits being downsized again by Congress, downsized to practically zero. But I'd also like to remind my colleagues about some of the reforms that we've already accomplished in 2012, because many of my colleagues have some very good ideas, and they've talked about, well, if we're going to deal with unemployment insurance, let's deal with it in a way that we can also make some structural reforms. In 2012, I was part of the conference committee between the House and the Senate, where legislation was formally considered in this body, in the other body, brought to a conference in regular order, and we had a very vigorous debate about the structure of unemployment compensation. And significant structural reforms are made to the program. So this is not a situation where we have neglected to look at the unemployment compensation program for years and years and years. It's 2 years ago that we made these changes. We strengthened the job search requirement. We've indeed allowed states, if they choose to drug screen applicants, which is an extremely controversial provision. But that was included because we were responding to particularly many members of the House of Representatives who said this has to be something the states can do. Well, this is something the states can do. I don't think most states have taken up the option, but this is something that they can do. Indeed, after the House passed this agreement, Chairman Camp issued a statement noting, his words, "The historic reforms to federal unemployment programs are an important part of this agreement. These reforms will now help the unemployed get the training and resources they need to move from an unemployment check to a paycheck. The package overturns arcane 1960s-era regulations and allows states to drug screen and test those most at risk." So I'm always willing to listen to proposals to make changes, but we have to recognize we made significant changes to this program. In Mr. Camp's words, sort of revising provisions that had been there since the 60s. And that was about 2 years ago. So we have made these changes. But we're willing to work in good faith if additional changes are necessary. But they shouldn't block a 3-month extension, much of it retroactive, that is pending before the Senate today. Let me say one other point, is that in the context of this debate, there's been the suggestion that, well, UI is in some way inappropriate, immoral. It encourages people to avoid work. It makes us, as Americans, lazy and dependent. That's not what I see when I go back home. What I see is people who say, even recognizing my efforts to try to get this bill passed, say, that's fine, but what I really want is a job. I want to work. I want to work for many reasons. One, the $350 a week I get, that barely keeps my family whole. It's a little help from gasoline. It's a little help with the rent, but I can't live on that. I have to have a job. Oh, and by the way, I think most Americans want to work because work defines us. Work gives us not just a place to go, but gives us a meaning to our lives, just as family does. And so this notion is that this is just this program that indulges those who don't want to work is profoundly wrong. And indeed, it's an insult to millions of Americans that desperately want a job. By definition, UI is based on their work history. This is not a program you qualify for by showing up. You've got to be fired, basically. You're going to be told, we can't keep you anymore. We're sorry. You're a good worker, but we can't keep you. You've got to go. In fact, if you're not a good worker, if you're fired for cause, you don't get these benefits. And then they actively have to keep looking for work. And as I said, in the 2012 provisions, legislative provisions, we gave the states more authority to make that active search much more active, much more real, not perfunctory, but but an active search. Now, because of the obstructions we've seen, most Americans now are just simply eligible for 26 weeks of assistance, the standard program administered by the states. But the Washington Post notes that it takes an average job seeker about 32 weeks to get hired, and in some cases even longer because of high unemployment. In my state, it's 9%. Now, there are some states where it's remarkably low because of the particular economic conditions there. But as the Post points out, for the average worker, it's 32 weeks. Well, those 26 weeks will not cover their unemployment period as they desperately search for work. And the other cruel fact is the longer you're unemployed, the harder it is to get a job. That's what we know from research. That's what we know from just our own sense of the economy. So the notion that someone like a chemical engineer who's been out of work for 7 months, who has a great record, the first time he or she has ever lost their job, should take the first thing available to him or her at the lowest cost, the lowest wage. One, I think it devalues their lifetime effort, and two, it potentially denies us of their productivity. I'd rather see a chemical engineer work in a job related to chemical engineering than stocking shelves, because his productivity, his contribution or her contribution to society will be much greater doing the job they were trained for and they have the experience to do. Our nation is at its best when everyone has the opportunity to put their talents, their skills, their experience to work. We need to get our country back to full employment. We all know that's the answer, that this is an emergency provision, a bridge, if you will, to a job. And we have to do more, not only to put people back to work, but to make the wages they receive allow them to live not just paycheck to paycheck, but allow them to live with a sense that they are building up some security for themselves and their family. We have the resources to achieve this. We are paying for this provision. We are not putting it on the shoulders of the next generation. We are limiting it to a very short period of time so that there is an opportunity to work and look at what we did in 2012 and see if we can do more. The question before us is, does this Senate have the will to make it happen? Renewing UI isn't the end of our efforts. Our efforts are to get the work out there so that people don't need it. That it's not 32 weeks to get a new job, it's several days, we hope. But this is the building block we need to put in place to move forward. This process, this expiration has caused Rhode Island, as my home state, great hardship. It's time to end that hardship. So I urge my colleagues rather, to renew this provision. This is one of those issues where it simply comes down, in my view, to this. This is the right thing to do. I honestly believe that there are many more than 60 of my colleagues that fundamentally believe this is the right thing to do and the right way to do it. The question is, will they vote that way in a few hours? I hope they do. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor and note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
There's something
Mr.
in
Alexander.
Montana.
The senator from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
And I ask unanimous consent that I be recognized to speak as of in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've been getting a lot of phone calls and emails this week about this issue of Iran. Just last night, my colleagues, almost all of my colleagues on the Republican side, and I sent a letter led by Senator Kirk, among others, to the majority leader asking him to have a vote on additional sanctions on Iran. These sanctions, of course, would be conditioned on failure of the additional negotiations that the administration has announced that will begin next week. I wanted to take a moment to explain to people back home who are writing, rightfully so, and calling us about this issue, about exactly what's at stake here now. So let me break it down to the most basic elements of what's happening. Iran is a country that, as we all know, beginning in 1979, was overtaken by a radical Islamic revolution to control the country, has been a sworn enemy of the United States ever since. In fact, until very recently, and perhaps they still do after Friday prayers, they used to end them with the chant, "Death to America." Now, one thing is to say those things, another thing is to actually do something about it. And in fact, Iran has. They have been one of the world's most active sponsors of terrorism all over this planet, but particularly in the Middle East. We know, for example, that they are actively engaged in undermining our interests all over the world. They have been linked to terrorist attacks against dignitaries from other countries, in other countries abroad. In fact, not so long ago, about 2 years ago, the report emerged that there was the potential they were trying to plot the assassination of a foreign ambassador here in Washington, D.C. In addition, they participate in things like cyber attacks against the country. They've destabilized their neighbors, and they continue to develop their weapons capability. In addition to all of that I've just outlined, over the last few years, Iran has begun to pursue a nuclear program. Now, in order to have a nuclear weapon, you have to be able to enrich uranium and reprocess plutonium. That takes infrastructure. And while people know how to do that, per se, it takes a lot of investment of time, energy, and expertise to actually build the facilities to enrich. Now, you can enrich for peaceful purposes if you want to have nuclear reactors to power your cities. That requires enrichment up to a certain level. But Iran has gone well beyond that. That's important for two reasons. The first is because there are plenty of countries in the world who have nuclear energy but don't enrich and don't reprocess. They import that material to use in their reactors. In fact, that's what most countries that have nuclear reactors do. But the second is that Iran's program has always has strong elements of secrecy. They've had all these secret facilities that they hide from the world. And the world is rightfully concerned. And so the United Nations Security Council, for example, which is usually lately a pretty useless body, but the United Nations Security Council actually came up with a resolution demanding that Iran stop the enrichment process. But they kept going. And in fact, until very recently, not so long ago, they discovered more secret facilities where Iran was enriching uranium and plutonium and reprocessing plutonium. So the administration has made it a high priority, as has their predecessor, to stop that from happening. And they've made clear statements that we're not seeking to contain a nuclear Iran, we want to prevent it. That's the right approach. Here's the problem. We recently entered in these negotiations with Iran to get them to stop doing these things, to back away from it. If you want nuclear power, if you want nuclear energy, you can have it without the need to reprocess, like most countries do, like many of our allies do. And the only reason why they even came to the table for those negotiations is because the United States, to be frank, despite the resistance of this administration, which each and every time sanctions and sanctions bills have come before the Congress, have threatened to veto it and have blocked it and have been against them, despite all of that, these sanctions are in place. They've been applied at a global level. They've created a tremendous amount of pressure on the Iranian economy, and as a result, they've come to the table to negotiate. Not because the new President Rouhani is a reformer, as some like to call him, but because they have so much internal pressure and their economy is under so much duress that they are afraid of what their people may do about it in the long term. The administration is pretty optimistic, I should say, about these negotiations that were reached. An interim agreement, or a temporary agreement as they call it, a joint plan of action is the right terminology. We had Secretary Sherman here, who was in charge of those talks the other day before the Foreign Relations Committee. And her point is, we accomplished something. We got Iran to stop processing at a certain level and suspend it. That's her point, And now we're going to go into the second phase of negotiating a longer-term solution, and we have to give diplomacy a chance. The problem is something's lost in translation. And perhaps before the Internet we didn't catch these things, but now we can see these things happening in real time. For some reason, Iran does not have the same interpretation that the United States does of this joint plan of action. For example, the head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, on November 24th, he said as follows, quote, "Work on the Arak, A-R-A-K, reactor is going to continue. Research and development will continue. All our exploration and extraction activities will continue. There are no activities that won't continue." The foreign minister on November 27th said, "Iran will pursue construction at the heavy water reactor," the same one I was just talking about, Arak. Iran's top nuclear negotiator said this, and this is really concerning, "We can return again to the 20% enrichment in less than 1 day, and we can convert the nuclear material again. Therefore," he's talking about the joint plan of action, "the structure of our nuclear program is preserved. We will in no way, never, dismantle our centrifuges." These are concerning statements. Their foreign minister said something else on CNN on January 22nd. Here's what he said, "We did not agree to dismantle anything." The White House version both underplays the concessions and overplays Iran's commitments. "We are not dismantling any centrifuges. We're not dismantling any equipment. We're simply not producing, not enriching over 5%. Here's the problem with this. The problem with this is that maybe they're not enriching right now. Quite frankly, it would be tough to tell because they've always had secret capabilities that we keep finding out about long after they've started. But more complicated is they're keeping all the process, the equipment in place. If they wanted to, as they accurately said, they can return to enriching at whatever level they want in less than 1 day. Now, you may ask yourself, why has Iran agreed to do these sorts of things? Here's what I said at the beginning, and I know now to be true more than ever. Here was Iran's strategy. It is the same one employed by North Korea a few years ago. Let's get into a negotiation. Let's see how many of these concessions, how many of these sanctions we can get lifted off of our shoulders. But let's not agree to anything that's irreversible. And here's what they're gambling on. They are gambling that the world's attention will turn to something else, that the sanctions will erode and people will lose the discipline or the willingness to continue, that countries that are export-driven want to sell things to Iran or get, gasoline from them and petroleum products from them, and therefore will agree to not continue with the sanctions. And then eventually one day in 2, 3, 4 years or whenever, they can decide to restart this stuff and suddenly announce, you know what, we want to be a nuclear weapons power after all. You know why I know, I don't suspect, I know that Iran wants a nuclear weapon? There are 2 reasons. The first is because they believe this is the ultimate insurance policy. If they have a nuclear weapon, people can't interfere with their internal politics because they're a nuclear power. And the other reason why I know is because they're developing ballistic missiles. Ballistic missiles are rockets that travel at long distances, and they cost a lot of money to develop and a lot of time. And the only reason why you develop that capability is to deliver a nuclear payload, to be able to deliver a nuclear weapon against somebody else, far away. Now, the administration's argument is, well, this is all for domestic consumption. This is all political posturing. That's what the administration is saying. In fact, by the way, yesterday, that was in reaction to Iran's top diplomat, who once again yesterday dismissed the Obama administration's demands on its nuclear program. He said they have no value. The best part of this joint plan of action, he said, is that it is so clear that research and development has no constraint. What he's basically saying is we can continue research and development and increasing our capabilities. That all stays in place. And what he's really saying is once the world is distracted and America moves to another topic or some other crisis happens somewhere else in the world, then we'll do what we want to do. That's what's happening here. And this is extremely dangerous for the future, because having a nuclear Iran is bad enough, but it isn't going to stop there. If Iran develops a nuclear capability and a nuclear weapon, every other country around them is going to want one as well. Saudi Arabia is going to want one. Potentially Turkey is going to want one. Eventually one day Egypt could want one. Can you imagine 4 or 5 nuclear weapons powers in the most unstable, dangerous region of the world? That's where we're headed. Here's another point. What about these countries that don't enrich right now? South Korea is an example. And we ask them not to enrich. We tell them, you don't need to enrich. We provide this stuff. How are we going to argue to them, don't enrich now? How are you going to tell Jordan and Saudi Arabia and other countries, you shouldn't enrich, but we have agreed to allow Iran to keep enriching? So we're going to tell our friends and our allies, you can't have this capability, you shouldn't have this capability, but we're going to tell an enemy of this country and of world peace that they can. And that's why we want a vote on these sanctions. We don't have room for error here. We do not have the space to be wrong on this. We can't afford to be wrong on this. Now, there's no guarantee that sanctions will prevent Iran from going nuclear, but I can tell you it will make it extremely painful. It will influence their cost-benefit analysis. And failure to put these sanctions in place are already having an impact. Every day we see news reports of businessmen in Europe and around the world flooding to Iran on the idea that the sanctions might be eroding. How are you going to pull that back? You won't be able to. I don't completely dismiss the notions that the administration is saying. It is ideal to reach a negotiated solution with Iran, but we have to be wise. We have to learn the lessons of history, and we have to understand human nature. This administration in Iran, this regime, they want a nuclear weapon because it gives them supremacy in the region and it makes them, they believe, immune to outside pressure and interference in their internal affairs. They are headed for a weapon. They are using these negotiations to buy time. Now, there are 59 members of this Senate that have signed on to a sanctions bill. And one person, one senator, is preventing a vote on it. And that is wrong. In a matter of this importance, we should have a vote on this. And the use of procedural motions and the power of the majority leader to prevent a vote on something of this importance has long-term implications on our national security of extraordinary proportions. And let me just close by making one more point with regards to this. I've recently read statements that those of us who want more sanctions are banging the war drum. That is false. On the contrary, we believe that a failure to put in place sanctions increases the likelihood of an armed conflict with Iran. Are we prepared to allow Iran to become a nuclear power, a nuclear weapons power? We're going into these negotiations with one arm tied behind our back. They're going and saying under no circumstances will we ever agree not to enrich, and we're saying we're open to that. I promise you, and that's why I'm saying this on the floor so that it's recorded and so people know where I stood on this before it happens. I promise you, if Iran is allowed to maintain any sort of enrichment capability within our lifetime, in fact, I believe before the end of this decade, God forbid, Iran will have a nuclear weapon, and one day we will wake up to the news that they have tested a device or have proven the capability of having one. And when that day comes, God help us all. So I hope that we can have a vote on the Senate floor on this issue. Let's have a debate on it. Let's have a frank and open discussion about it. But why are we preventing that from happening? Why is the majority leader preventing that from happening? It is inexcusable. It is unacceptable. And so I hope we'll have a vote on it sooner rather than later. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Republican whip.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, it was widely reported yesterday and continues to be the buzz about town, the latest Congressional Budget Office report known as its long-term outlook. And, of course, we know from the news that its report on the Affordable Care Act is absolutely devastating. According to the Congressional Budget Office, Obamacare will reduce full-time employment by 2 million workers in the year 2017 and 2.5 million by the year 2024. The reason for that is pretty clear, that with the employer mandate and the additional costs associated with Obamacare, many employers will simply put people from full-time work onto part-time work in order to avoid the employer mandate and those penalties and those additional costs. We human beings are enormously sensitive to incentives, both positive and negative, and this is pretty predictable, but it's tragic. The reduction will be almost entirely, the Congressional Budget Office says, a reduction in labor force participation and then in the number of hours worked. In other words, this was a piece of legislation that we were told would enormously benefit not only individual Americans by getting them access to care, but the President said it would benefit the economy as a whole. And what we're learning is the sad truth is that it is hurting the economy and hurting the very people that I presume the President wanted to help. I heard Representative Ryan on the news talk about this as a poverty trap. And of course, many of the folks who supported the Affordable Care Act, and I'm thinking now about organized labor, have petitioned the President and his allies and said, this is turning into a nightmare for us. And this is one of the things they mention, is it because people are being moved from full-time work onto part-time work. And I might just add, Mr. President, it's no answer to say, well, we're just going to order an increase of 40% in the minimum wage. In other words, you can see that moving people from 40 hours a week to 30 hours a week, perhaps there might be in the minds of some people say, well, we'll compensate for that. We will order businesses to pay at least $10.10 an hour. When simple common sense tells us that many of the people, again, who you're trying to help are the ones that are going to be hurt the most. High unemployment among minorities and teenagers. And what's the small business going to do when the government orders them to pay $10.10 an hour without regard to the markets or the economics? Well, they're going to hire fewer people or perhaps go out of business. So this sort of micromanagement and attempts to compensate for the effects of Obamacare, I think, will make things worse, not better. Needless to say, if the advocates of the Affordable Care Act had understood back in 2009, 2010, what the facts would turn out to be today, then Obamacare never would have passed. Millions of Americans said that they liked the coverage they already had. I think the poll numbers I've seen showed between 88 and 90%. People said, we like what we have. Certainly we'd like to have it more affordable, but we like the coverage we had. And if these people had known that they would have their coverage canceled because it failed to meet the mandates of Obamacare, Obamacare never would have passed. And those people who liked the coverage they had would still be paying lower premiums than they are now being charged in the exchanges under Obamacare, not to mention the huge deductibles. I mean, families are now being asked to essentially self-insure up to $5,000 for their deductible. Now, you can say, well, you get the tax subsidy and you've got better coverage beyond that, but you still got $5,000 deductible. And those are the first dollars that come out of consumers' pockets. So you might as well be self-insured, but for catastrophic health care needs. And, of course, there's a lot cheaper way for people to buy that kind of coverage. So we also know that untold number of Americans would still have access to at least 40 hours of work, which is not the case, sadly, currently under Obamacare, and we know now with the projections of the Congressional Budget Office that things will continue to get worse. So the President's health care law has become a genuine public policy disaster. And by the way, Mr. President, you know, even the Congressional Budget Office said at least 30 million people will still be uninsured even if Obamacare was implemented exactly as advertised. So not even that addresses what I always thought was the main reason for Obamacare, and that's to give people more coverage, cover more people. Well, so Obamacare will be reducing, or is reducing, full-time employment at a time when the percentage of people participating in job-seeking, the workforce, is at a historic low. Many people have given up. They've just quit looking, and they get dropped out of that unemployment statistic. So when the number comes down, when we actually think, well, maybe we're doing better, maybe the economy's stronger, well, we find out, for example, in December alone, that 345,000 people quit looking for jobs. They quit. They got worn out. They gave up because they have been looking for so long and the jobs just aren't there. So just to be clear, the question in 2009 and 2010 was not whether we would expand health coverage, but how we would do it. Obamacare represented one option, and it's obviously the one that our Democratic colleagues chose to adopt on a party line vote. I would say that despite what the President suggested yet again in his State of the Union message, there are a lot of options out there, so it's not Obamacare or nothing, which is what is so often mentioned. I hear some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle say, well, we got to have Obamacare because only then can we cover people with pre-existing conditions. That's poppycock. It's not true. We could do it cheaper and more effectively by other alternatives. And we hear people say, well, the only way that young people can be covered up to age 26 was with Obamacare under their family's health care. That's poppycock, too. It's just not true. And to suggest that you got to have basically the whole enchilada, you got to buy all of Obamacare, trillions of dollars, along with all of its negative consequences in order to address these health care concerns, is just false. It's not true. You know, I've heard the President say one time, if I've heard him say it one time, I've heard him say it 1,000. He said, well, if critics of Obamacare have a better idea, just bring them to me. Well, I would like to respectfully suggest that the President has just a tin ear when it comes to alternatives, and he just is not listening. Now, one of the latest proposals came out of three of our best experts in the Republican side on the health care issue. Senator Orrin Hatch, the ranking member of the Finance Committee, Senator Richard Burr, and Senator Dr. Tom Coburn. And they released a comprehensive blueprint for what our alternative might look like. But it's, at some point, there's got to be a resolution of this, because policies are being canceled, their costs for people with coverage are going up, and it's hurting the economy. It's turning full-time work into part-time work. At some point, I don't know when it is, maybe after the November election, I'm just guessing now, when we're going to have to confront this reality and deal with it in order to protect our constituents, the people we are here privileged to represent. So the alternative to what the President's command and control to the government takeover, 1/6 of our economy, is simply under Obamacare, the government gets to choose. Under the alternative, our alternative, you get to choose. I want to highlight just a few more of the findings in the Congressional Budget Office report. Last March, the President told ABC News that for the next 10 years, America's debt is going to be in a sustainable place. Now, I'm afraid what the President is he's falling in a trap here, because we're living in a surreal time when interest rates are so low because of what the Federal Reserve is doing that, yes, the interest we have to pay on our debt is not as much as it would be if it went back up to historical norms, 4 or 5%. The sustainability of our national debt is highly contingent. And by the way, Mr. President, somebody's going to have to pay that back someday. And these young people sitting here listening, they're going to be the ones left holding the bag. People like my two daughters who are working in Austin, Texas. Somebody's going to have to pay that money back. And for the President to say our debt's sustainable for the next 10 years ignores the fact we have a moral obligation to deal with it today, not to make these young people to dampen their aspirations, their potential, and their pursuit of the American dream by saddling them with a bunch of debt that they didn't charge up. But the fact is that our debt is highly contingent on three factors. the economic growth of our economy, how fast our economy is growing, inflation is the second one, and interest rates, which I've alluded to. But according to the Congressional Budget Office, if America's real economic growth rate were just 1/10 of a percentage lower than that it projects currently each year over the next decade, our cumulative debt, the annual difference between what we collect in taxes and what the federal government spends over the next 10 years would go up by $311 billion. That's with a B. Likewise, if annual inflation was 1 percentage point above what the Congressional Budget Office projects, our cumulative deficits, in other words, our debt, the difference between what we bring in tax dollars and what the federal government spends, projected over 10 years, it would be $762 billion higher. So that's if just inflation. You can see with the just minor changes in the growth rate or in inflation can have dramatic consequences in terms of the debt. And yes, you don't have to just pay the principal back. You got to pay the interest on that debt. And as I said, while interest rates are at historic lows because of the quantitative easing, so-called, that the Federal Reserve is doing, churning out dollars, of course, it's been a boon to the stock market and the top 1% of our economy, but working people, they're finding their wages that have been stagnant for the last 5 years. But if interest rates were to rise 1 percentage point above the current Congressional Budget Office baseline each year, our cumulative deficits or our debt would go up $1.5 trillion. That's with a T, not a B, trillion. So these numbers confirm that despite the short-term deficit reduction produced by the Budget Control Act, we have seen some bending of the spending curve under the Budget Control Act. Of course, that has been, those caps have been lifted as a result of the budget negotiations between Senator Murray and Congressman Ryan. America is still dangerously vulnerable to a fiscal shock. We experienced one of those back in 2008, and we are still vulnerable to a fiscal shock. If things change in terms of growth, inflation, and interest rates, any one of those could have a dramatic impact, making things much, much more difficult, much, much worse. Well, to quote the Congressional Budget Office once again, over the next decade, debt held by the public will be significantly greater relative to the gross domestic product or the economy than at any time since just after World War II. Now, coming out of a world war, you can understand why the debt was high, but it's higher. Debt held by the public will be significantly greater relative to the economy than at any time since that time. And we haven't had a comparable world war that would justify this huge run-up in debt. They went on to say that with debt so large, federal spending on interest payments alone will increase substantially as interest rates rise to more typical levels. I mentioned that. Going on, they say, moreover, because federal borrowing generally reduces national savings, the capital stock and wages will be smaller than if the debt was lower. So that's what they call the crowding out effect. So if the federal government's borrowing all this money, it makes it harder and more expensive for the private sector to do the borrowing they need, and there's a crowding out effect and a depressing effect on economic growth. So America's massive debt is already hurting our economy. It's exacerbating the already difficult situation that people are experiencing when they're looking for work and they can't find work. And the problem will get worse, not better, as time goes by, because we've seen the difference that inflation, that growth, and that interest rates can have, which can allow this to spiral out of control. And that doesn't even address the other concerns that many of us have about the unsustainability of Medicare and Social Security. These are sacred promises we made to our seniors that if that it would be there for them if they were once they reach a qualifying age. And they won't be on the current track. These young people, I doubt any of them believe that Social Security or Medicare will be there for them, and we have the way to deal with that today if we'll simply take advantage of that opportunity. I'd like to note that every single member of the Republican caucus has co-sponsored a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. I hear it from members of my own party that said, you guys weren't all that great when you were in charge. You guys spent money we didn't have, and that's true. Now, we were pikers by comparison because back in 1997, the debt was $5.3 trillion. $5.3 trillion in 1997. That was the last time we had a vote in the Senate on a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, and we came within one vote of passing a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. But today, the debt's $17 trillion plus, $17.2 trillion. And the President says our debt's on a sustainable path. Well, it's just not true. It's whistling past the graveyard, and it's endangering our prosperity and our opportunity, not only just for the younger generation, but for people today who want to find work and want to provide for their families and pursue their version of the American dream. We can't defy the laws of fiscal gravity forever, and we can't expect to keep piling up debt without damaging our economy. I expect next week Senator Sanders from Vermont will bring a bill to the floor ostensibly to help our veterans, something we all support, but which is unpaid for and would add roughly $25 billion, at least $25 billion to that national debt. We just can't keep doing this day after day after day without enormous risk. Mr. President, I see my colleague from New Hampshire on the floor, so I'll close with this thought. Here's the sad facts since President Obama took office in January 2009, admittedly coming off of a fiscal crisis at a very bad place for our economy. But this is his record over the last 5 years. The number of long-term unemployed has increased by close to 1.2 million people. Increased. And the labor force participation rate that I mentioned a moment ago has fallen by 2.9%. 2.9% fewer Americans actually looking for work today than were in January 2009. Here's another sad statistic. Since January 2009, the average amount of time the unemployed have been without a job has nearly doubled. People have doubled the time they've been out of work, looking for work, since January 2009, rising from 19.8 weeks to 37 weeks. The number of people on food stamps has increased by 48.3%, reaching 47.4 million people in October. In 2008, the total cost of the food stamp program, something we all support as a safety net program for the most vulnerable, but we spent $37 billion in 2008, and now it's more than doubled to almost $80 billion. This is under President Obama's 5 years in office. And the number of people receiving Social Security disability has increased from 7.4 million people to 8.9 million. Meanwhile, the total number of Social Security disability beneficiaries, including spouses and children of disabled workers receiving benefits, has increased from 9.3 million to roughly 11 million. This is not the way it's supposed to be. I know that everyone who is out of a job wants a job, and the dignity and the self-respect that comes with it. And certainly we need to protect people who are at risk of falling through the safety net, but more than anything, we need to give them the opportunity to get back to work and to provide for their family, put food on the table. And we can't be content with the status quo, with huge amounts of money being spent on disability, huge amounts of money being spent on food stamps, and huge amounts of money being paid to people who can't even find a job. We got to get our economy growing again so that these folks can lift themselves up and get back in the workforce and to provide for their families and to pursue their dreams. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I have 9 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders, so I ask unanimous